knife was already halfway drawn before Ren understood what he was looking at. He had not meant to see anything. He had only stepped behind the velvet curtain near the northern wall of the great hall to steady a wobbling tray of wine goblets, hidden from the hundreds of guests celebrating below. The Alpha King's coronation feast roared around him, full of laughter and music and the clatter of silver plates, and nobody ever looked twice at an Omega servant standing in the shadows. That was the whole point of standing in the shadows. Nobody looked, nobody noticed. And because nobody noticed him, two men in fine gray coats did not notice him either when they leaned close together near the same curtain and spoke in voices meant only for each other. "Tonight," one of them murmured, "before he retires, the wine from the Western Vineyard, the 10th bottle in the crate. Make sure it reaches his table and no other." The second man nodded once, sharp and quick, like a bird pecking at grain. "And if the guard captain checks the crates?" "He won't, not tonight. Everyone will be too busy admiring their new king." Ren stood frozen behind the curtain, his heart slamming so hard he was certain the fabric itself must be trembling with it. He recognized the voice of the first man. It belonged to Lord Garrick Voss, the king's most trusted advisor, a man who had sat at Cale Draven's right hand since before Ren was even born into the pack. And they were talking about poison. They were talking about killing the king on the very night he had been crowned. Ren's hands shook so badly that one of the goblets nearly slipped from the tray. He caught it just in time, pressing it flat against his chest, and forced himself to breathe slowly through his nose, the way his mother had taught him to do whenever fear threatened to swallow him whole. "This is not your business," a voice in his head whispered. "You are an Omega. You serve the wine. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not question the nobles. You do not exist to them, and that is the safest way to exist at all." But another voice, quieter and stubborn, refused to be silent. "If you say nothing, the king will die tonight, and you will have let it happen." He peered around the edge of the curtain. The great hall stretched out before him in all its golden light. Hundreds of pack members gathered beneath banners bearing the crest of House Draven, a silver wolf howling at a crescent moon. At the head of the hall, seated upon a throne carved from black oak and lined with fur, sat the new Alpha King himself. Cale Draven was not a comfortable man to look at directly. He had a presence that seemed to press against the air around him. Shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway, a jaw set in a permanent line of quiet authority. Dark hair swept back from a face that rarely smiled, and never needed to in order to command a room. He had inherited his throne only that morning, after his father's long illness finally claimed him, and already the weight of the crown seemed to sit naturally upon him, as though it had always belonged there. Warriors twice his age lowered their eyes when he passed. Nobles who had ruled small territories for decades bowed without being asked. He was, by every account Ren had ever heard whispered in the kitchens, the strongest alpha their pack had seen in 3 generations. And in a matter of hours, if nobody stopped it, he would be dead. Ren set the tray down with trembling hands on a side table and wiped his palms against his plain gray tunic. He told himself he was being foolish. He told himself that someone else would notice, that a guard would catch the poisoned bottle before it ever reached the king's table, that surely fate would not allow such a terrible thing to happen on the very night a new king was crowned. But even as he told himself these comforting lies, his feet were already moving, carrying him out from behind the curtain and into the crowded hall, weaving between silk skirts and polished boots, his eyes fixed on the black oak throne at the far end of the room. Every step felt like walking toward a cliff's edge. Omegas did not approach the throne uninvited. Omegas did not approach the king at all unless summoned, and even then only with their heads bowed and their voices soft. To do otherwise was to invite punishment, or worse, to invite ridicule so severe it could follow a person for the rest of their life. Ren had seen it happen to others. He had seen an Omega girl dismissed from the pack entirely for the crime of laughing too loudly at a noble's joke. He had seen a young Omega boy struck across the face simply for standing too close to a seated alpha during a feast 3 winters ago. The rules were not written down anywhere, and yet everyone knew them, the way everyone knows to fear fire without being told twice. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was silence, and a king dead by morning, and a poison that Ren alone knew was waiting in a crate of wine. He reached the base of the dais where the throne sat elevated above the rest of the hall, guarded on either side by 2 warriors in ceremonial armor, their spears crossed in front of the steps. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Rhett Calloway who served as the captain of the king's personal guard, glanced down at Ren with visible surprise. "You cannot be here, Omega," Rhett said, not unkindly, but firmly. "Return to your station." "Please," Ren whispered, his voice barely audible over the music and laughter filling the hall. "I need to speak to the king. It cannot wait." Nothing an Omega servant has to say cannot wait, Rhett replied, already reaching to steer Ren away by the shoulder. But something in Ren's face must have caught the king's attention, because at that exact moment, Cale Draven's dark eyes shifted from the noble he had been speaking with and landed directly on the trembling servant standing at the base of his throne. The king raised one hand, and Rhett froze mid-motion, releasing Ren's shoulder at once. The hall did not go silent yet, not quite. The music continued, and the laughter continued, and most of the guests remained entirely unaware that anything unusual was happening near the throne. But those closest, the nobles seated at the high tables, the guards standing at attention, the servants moving between courses, all of them slowly began to notice the strange sight of an Omega standing before the king's dais, staring up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Come here," Cale said. His voice was low, but it carried, the way a king's voice always carries even when he does not raise it. Ren climbed the steps of the dais on legs that felt made of water. He had never stood this close to an alpha king in his entire life, had never been permitted near enough to see the small scar above Cale's left eyebrow, or the faint gray beginning at his temples despite his youth, or the sheer size of him up close, broad enough that Ren felt like a child standing before a mountain. "Speak quickly," Cale said, leaning slightly forward in his throne. "What is so urgent that you would risk your standing to say it?" Ren's mouth had gone completely dry. He glanced around at the guards, at the nearby nobles who had begun to notice, at Lord Garrick Voss himself, seated only a short distance away at the high table, watching this entire exchange with an expression that had gone carefully, deliberately blank. If Ren spoke too loudly, if he announced the plot for the whole hall to hear, Voss would know instantly who had discovered him, and there would be no undoing that. Whatever chance existed of catching the traitor unaware would vanish the moment the words left Ren's mouth in front of witnesses. So instead, trembling, Ren leaned forward, closer than any Omega had ever been permitted to lean toward an Alpha King, close enough that his lips nearly brushed the shell of Cale's ear, and he whispered. He told him everything. The two men behind the curtain. Lord Garrick Voss's voice, unmistakable and cold. The crate of wine from the Western Vineyard. The 10th bottle. The plan to have it reach the king's table before he retired for the night. He whispered it all in a single breathless rush, his heart hammering so violently he was certain the king must be able to feel it through the small distance between them. And then he stepped back, his part done, and waited. The change in Cale Draven's face happened so quickly that anyone watching closely would remember it for years afterward. The color drained from his skin in the space of a single heartbeat, leaving him pale as the bone-white fur lining his throne. His jaw, already set in its usual hard line, tightened further, and his dark eyes flicked once, sharply, toward the high table where Lord Garrick Voss sat sipping his wine with practiced calm. The nobles nearest the throne noticed the shift immediately. Conversation faltered, heads turned. Whatever the Omega servant had whispered, it had clearly struck the new king like a physical blow, and word of that reaction spread through the hall in ripples, guest to guest, table to table, until within moments the music itself seemed to falter, and the entire great hall fell into a hush so complete that the crackling of torches along the walls became audible for the first time all evening. Everyone was staring now, staring at the pale-faced king, staring at the trembling Omega who had dared whisper something into his ear that no servant should ever have been close enough to say, staring, above all, at the sudden and terrible silence that had swallowed a celebration meant to be filled with joy. Cale rose from his throne slowly, deliberately, his gaze never leaving Lord Garrick Voss across the hall. Voss, to his credit, did not flinch, though Ren, standing close enough to see every detail, noticed the advisor's knuckles whiten slightly around the stem of his wineglass. "Captain Calloway," Cale said, his voice carrying now with a coldness that silenced the last murmurs in the hall entirely. "Bring me the crate of Western Vineyard wine that was delivered for tonight's feast. All of it, immediately." Rhett bowed sharply and signaled to two other guards, who hurried from the hall at once. "Your Majesty," Lord Garrick Voss said smoothly, rising from his seat with an expression of polite concern, arranged carefully across his face. "Is something wrong? Shall I assist in some way?" "No," Cale said, his eyes fixed on the advisor with an intensity that made several nearby nobles shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Sit down, Garrick. Enjoy the feast. I only wish to inspect the wine myself before it is served further." A king's caution, nothing more. It was, Ren understood, a lie meant to buy time, to keep the traitor calm and unaware of how much had already been revealed, while the true evidence was gathered quietly behind the scenes. He admired the swiftness of Cale's mind even in that terrifying moment, the way the king had absorbed a devastating truth and, within seconds, constructed a plan to act upon it without alerting his enemy. Cale turned to Ren then, and for the first time since Ren had approached the throne, something other than cold calculation flickered across the king's face. It was not gratitude exactly, not yet, but something close to it, mixed with a wariness that suggested the king was still trying to understand who this trembling servant truly was, and how he had come to possess such dangerous knowledge. "Come with me," Cale said quietly, so quietly that only Ren could hear it. "Now, before anyone else thinks to ask you questions I do not yet want answered." Ren nodded, unable to speak, and followed the king down from the dais and toward a side corridor that led away from the great hall, away from the hundreds of eyes still watching in stunned confusion, away from Lord Garrick Voss's carefully composed smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Behind them, the feast slowly resumed its noise, though quieter now, more hesitant, as though the entire hall sensed that something significant had just occurred and none of them yet understood what it was. Musicians picked their instruments back up. Servants continued pouring wine, though Ren noticed with a small shiver of relief that the Western Vineyard crates had vanished from the serving tables entirely, whisked away by Rhett's guards before a single additional bottle could be poured. As they walked, Cale glanced sideways at the Omega beside him, studying his face as though trying to solve a puzzle. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ren, Your Majesty, Ren Ashby." "Ren Ashby," Cale repeated, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth. "You risked everything tonight. You're standing in this pack, perhaps your life. If I had reacted differently to an Omega whispering uninvited into my ear before an entire hall of witnesses." "I know," Ren said softly. "I could not let you drink from that bottle, Your Majesty, whatever the cost to me." Cale said nothing for several long strides, his expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight of the corridor. But when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier coldness, replaced by something that sounded almost like curiosity. "We will speak more of this," he said, "in private, where no one else can listen. Tonight, Ren Ashby, you may have saved my life. I intend to understand exactly how, and exactly why, a servant nobody bothers to notice, was the only one paying enough attention to notice a king's death being planned in plain sight." They reached a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor, flanked by two more guards who straightened instantly at the king's approach. Cale paused before it, his hand resting on the iron handle, and looked back at Ren one final time. "Whatever happens next," the king said quietly, "you have already changed everything. There is no going back to being invisible now." Ren swallowed hard, uncertain whether those words were meant as comfort or warning, and followed the king through the door into whatever came next. The private chamber Cale led him into was smaller than Ren expected, lit only by a low fire in the hearth and two oil lamps on a wide wooden desk covered in maps and papers. It smelled of cedar and old parchment. The king closed the door himself, sliding a heavy bolt across it, and for a long moment simply stood with his back to it, staring at Ren as though still trying to decide whether the events of the last few minutes had truly happened. "Sit," Cale said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. Ren hesitated. Servants did not sit in the presence of alphas, let alone kings, but the look on Cale's face left no room for argument, so Ren lowered himself carefully onto the edge of the chair, hands folded tightly in his lap. "Tell me everything," Cale said, pulling a second chair around to face him directly, close enough that their knees nearly touched. "From the beginning, leave nothing out, no matter how small it seems." Ren took a steadying breath and recounted it all again, more slowly this time, with none of the panic that had rushed his earlier whisper. He described stepping behind the curtain to steady his tray, the two men in gray coats, the unmistakable voice of Lord Garrick Voss speaking of poison and timing, and the 10th bottle in the crate. He described the second man's quick, bird-like nod of agreement. He described his own fear, the terrible certainty that if he said nothing, a king would be dead by morning. Cale listened without interrupting, his dark eyes fixed on Ren's face the entire time, occasionally narrowing at certain details, as though committing every word to memory. When Ren finished, a long silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. "You are certain it was Garrick's voice," Cale said finally. "It was not really a question. I have heard him speak in the kitchens many times, Your Majesty. When he comes to discuss the feast preparations with the head cook, I would know his voice anywhere." Cale leaned back in his chair, rubbing one hand slowly across his jaw, a gesture that made him look, for just a moment, less like a king, and more like an exhausted young man carrying a burden far too heavy for his years. "Garrick Voss," he said quietly, almost to himself. "He served my father for 20 years. He taught me how to read treaties before I could properly read at all. He was the first person to congratulate me this morning when the crown was placed on my head. He shook his head slowly. And you are telling me he intended to have me poisoned before the sun rose on my first full day as king? I know how it must sound, Ren said carefully. I would not have believed it either, if I had not heard it with my own ears. I believe you, Cale said, surprising him. That is precisely the trouble. I believe you completely, and that terrifies me more than anything else that has happened tonight. A knock sounded at the door, 3 sharp raps, and Cale rose to unbolt it. Rhett Calloway stood on the other side, his expression grim, holding a single dark green bottle wrapped carefully in a cloth. We found it, Your Majesty, Rhett said, stepping inside once Cale waved him through. The 10th bottle in the crate from the Western Vineyard, exactly as described. It was already set aside from the others, positioned near the top where it would be easy to reach when your table was served. Has it been tested? Cale asked. Not yet. I did not want to risk handling it further without your instruction, but there is something odd about the wax seal at the neck. It has been tampered with and resealed, poorly. Whoever did this was skilled with poison, but not so skilled with disguising their work. Cale took the bottle carefully, turning it over in his hands, studying the seal beneath the lamplight. Ren watched the king's jaw tighten again as he examined it, the same pale expression from the great hall threatening to return to his face. Have it tested by the pack physician tonight, quietly, with no one else present, Cale instructed. I want confirmation of what poison was used before I take any further action. And Rhett, listen carefully. No one outside this room is to know what we have found. Not the guards who retrieved it, not the physician, no one. If Garrick learns we have discovered his plot before I am ready to move against him, he may flee, or worse, he may act more directly and more quickly than poison allows. Rhett nodded sharply. Understood, Your Majesty. And the Omega? His eyes flicked toward Ren with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between suspicion and grudging respect. What is to be done about him? All those in the hall saw him approach the throne. There will be questions. Cale was quiet for a moment, considering. Let them wonder, he said finally. A king does not owe explanations for who he chooses to speak with, but I want Ren kept close, under careful watch, for his own protection. If Garrick suspects it was this Omega who exposed him, I do not trust that he will simply accept defeat quietly. Ren's stomach twisted at those words. He had been so consumed by the fear of what might happen to the king that he had not fully considered what might happen to himself once the truth came to light. If Lord Garrick Voss discovered that a lowly Omega servant had unraveled his careful plans, what might a desperate, powerful man do to silence him? You will stay here in the castle, in chambers near my own, until this matter is fully resolved, Cale said, turning back to Ren once Rhett had departed with the bottle. I will assign guards to watch over you discreetly. This is not a request, Ren Ashby. It is for your safety. Your Majesty, I do not wish to be a burden, or to draw attention that might make things more difficult for you, Ren said quickly. I am only a servant. I can return to my duties as though nothing happened tonight. Nothing happened tonight, Cale repeated, a faint, humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. An entire hall watched you whisper into my ear, and watched my face turn the color of ash in response. Half the pack is likely already inventing wild stories to explain it. No, Ren, there is no quiet return to invisibility for you now. Not after this. I would rather you be safe under my watch than left exposed to whatever Garrick decides to do once he realizes his plan has failed. Ren lowered his eyes, uncertain how to respond to the strange mixture of gratitude and fear churning inside him. Being noticed by the king, being kept close to him, was something an Omega servant was never meant to experience, and though part of him understood the practical necessity of it, another part of him worried desperately about what such closeness might mean, both for his safety and for the rigid, unspoken rules that governed every interaction between Alpha and Omega in their world. May I ask you something, Your Majesty? Ren said quietly, after a moment. Cale, who had moved to stand near the fire, glanced back at him. You may. Why did you listen to me at all? An Omega, uninvited, approaching your throne before an entire hall. Most Alphas would have had me removed before I ever reached the steps. Cale considered the question seriously, his gaze drifting to the flames for a moment before he answered. Because I saw your face before you ever reached the dais, he said. Fear, yes, but not the fear of someone seeking attention, or hoping to cause a scene. It was the fear of someone carrying something they desperately did not want to carry alone. I have seen enough false fear in this court to recognize the true kind when it stands before me. Ren said nothing, but something in his chest loosened slightly at the king's words, a small unraveling of the tension that had gripped him since the moment he overheard Garrick Voss behind the curtain. They spoke for a while longer, Cale asking careful questions about Ren's life in the castle. how long he had served, whether he had family within the pack, whether he had noticed anything else unusual in recent weeks that might connect to the plot against him. Ren answered honestly, mentioning his younger sister Maeve, who also worked in the castle kitchens, and a friend named Ellen Marsh who served alongside him in the Great Hall. He mentioned nothing else unusual, though he promised to think carefully and report anything that came to mind later. Eventually Rhett returned once more, this time alone, his face grave in the lamplight. "The physician has confirmed it, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "The wine was poisoned, a slow-acting toxin, difficult to detect by taste alone, designed to take effect hours after consumption, likely during your sleep, when no one would think to question a king simply failing to wake. Had you drunk from that bottle tonight, you would not have survived until morning." The room fell silent at those words. Ren watched Cale's hands curl slowly into fists at his sides, watched the muscle in his jaw tighten with a fury that the king was clearly working hard to control. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerously steady. "Then we know for certain what we are dealing with," Cale said. "A trusted advisor, a man who has sat at my father's side and mine for 2 decades, attempting to end my life on the very first night of my reign." He turned to look at Ren, and something in his expression shifted, hardened with new purpose. "I will not act rashly. Garrick Voss will not simply be arrested tonight, dragged away in chains before the pack has even settled from the feast. I need to understand the full scope of this plot before I move. Was he acting alone? Was there another hand guiding his, some rival pack seeking to weaken us through treachery from within? I need answers before I have justice." "How can I help?" Ren asked, surprising himself with the question, and surprising Cale as well, judging by the slight widening of the king's eyes. "You have already helped more than you know," Cale said, "but if you are willing, there may be more you can do. You move through this castle unnoticed in ways that guards and nobles cannot. Servants speak freely around other servants in ways they never would around alphas. If Garrick has accomplices, if there is more to this plot than what you overheard tonight, you may be positioned to learn of it before anyone else." Ren nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what was being asked of him. It was dangerous, certainly, perhaps even more dangerous than what he had already done that night. But he had already crossed the line that separated silence from action, and there was no returning to the comfortable invisibility he had known before. Whatever came next, he would face it, not because he had been ordered to, but because he had chosen to, the moment he stepped out from behind that curtain and climbed the steps of the king's dais. "I will help however I can, Your Majesty," Ren said quietly. Cale studied him for a long moment in the firelight, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes. "Then let us begin," he said. "Tell me again about the second man beside Garrick. Everything you remember about his voice, his clothing, the way he stood. Every detail matters now." Outside the chamber, the castle had begun to quiet, as the feast wound toward its natural end, guests retiring to their beds unaware of the danger that had nearly claimed their new king's life. But within the small firelit room, a king and an Omega servant sat close together, piecing apart the fragile threads of a conspiracy that had only just begun to unravel, neither of them yet aware of how far its roots truly extended, nor how much more they would have to uncover before the pack was safe again. Morning arrived with a pale gray light that seeped through the narrow windows of the chamber Cale had assigned to Ren, a small but comfortable room near the king's own quarters, guarded discreetly by 2 warriors stationed at either end of the corridor. Ren had barely slept, his mind circling endlessly through the events of the previous night, the poisoned bottle, the king's pale face, the strange new closeness that had formed between them in the span of a single evening. When a soft knock came at his door just after dawn, he startled upright, half expecting bad news. It was only Ellen Marsh, her dark curls pulled back hastily, and her eyes wide with worry and curiosity in equal measure. She slipped inside the moment Ren opened the door, glancing back down the corridor as though checking for anyone listening. "Everyone in the kitchens is talking about nothing else," she whispered, sitting beside him on the edge of the narrow bed. "They say you whispered something to the king that made him go white as snow. They say guards searched the wine crates afterward. They say you have been given your own room near the king's chambers, guarded like a noble." She studied his face carefully. "Ren, what happened last night? Are you in danger?" Ren hesitated. Cale had been clear that the details of the plot were to remain secret, known only to the smallest circle possible, until the king decided how to proceed. But Ellen was his closest friend, and he trusted her completely, and more than that, he suspected he might need her help before this was over. "I cannot tell you everything," he said quietly, "but I can tell you this much. Someone tried to harm the king last night, and I overheard the plan before it could be carried out. That is why he wanted me kept close, for my own protection, in case whoever was responsible realizes it was me who exposed them. Elin's face paled. Who would dare such a thing, on the very night of his coronation? I do not know everything yet, Ren said, but please, Elin, you must not repeat what I have told you, not to anyone, not even Maeve. Lives may depend on this remaining quiet a while longer. Elin nodded solemnly, though worry still creased her brow. I will say nothing, but Ren, promise me you will be careful. If someone in this castle was willing to harm the king himself, what would stop them from harming you, an Omega with no titles and no protection beyond a king's temporary favor? It was a fair question, one that had already occurred to Ren more than once during his sleepless night, but before he could answer, a firm knock sounded at the door, and Rhett Calloway's voice called through it. Ren Ashby, the king requests your presence immediately. Elin squeezed his hand once before slipping out through a side passage, and Ren followed Rhett through the quiet morning corridors of the castle, past servants who paused their work to stare, past nobles who whispered behind raised hands as he passed, all of them clearly having heard some version of the previous night's events, though none of them knowing the true shape of what had actually occurred. Cale was waiting in the same private chamber as before, though this time he was not alone. A woman Ren did not recognize stood beside him, dressed in the deep blue robes that marked her as a member of the castle's healing order, and an older man with sharp, calculating eyes sat at the desk studying a collection of scattered papers. Ren, Cale said, gesturing him forward. This is Duncan Pierce, who oversees intelligence matters for the crown, and Priya Sundaram, our head physician, who confirmed the poison last night. I have brought them into this matter, along with Rhett, forming the smallest possible circle of trust while we determine how to proceed against Garrick. Duncan Pierce studied Ren with an assessing gaze that made the Omega feel as though he were being measured and weighed for some unspoken purpose. The Omega who saved a king's life, Duncan said, his voice dry but not unkind. Tell me precisely what you heard last night, in your own words, leaving out nothing, no matter how insignificant it may seem to you. Ren recounted the conversation once more, growing more practiced with each retelling, though the fear of that moment never quite faded from his voice. Duncan listened with narrowed eyes, occasionally jotting notes on a scrap of parchment, and when Ren finished, the intelligence advisor leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful frown. The second man you describe, quick and bird-like in his movements, nodding sharply, rather than speaking much, Duncan said slowly. That description matches a servant in Lord Garrick's personal household, a man named Colton Reyes, who has served him for several years. If Garrick required assistance obtaining and tampering with a specific bottle from a specific crate, he would need someone with intimate knowledge of the feast preparations and direct access to the wine stores. Colton fits that requirement precisely. Can we bring him in for questioning? Cale asked. Carefully, Duncan cautioned. If we move against Colton too visibly, Garrick will know immediately that his plot has been discovered, and we lose whatever advantage remains in understanding the full scope of what he intended. I would suggest a quieter approach. Allow me to speak with Colton alone, under some pretense unrelated to the poisoning, and see what I might learn without alerting Garrick to our suspicions. Cale considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. Do it carefully, Duncan. I want answers, but I do not want to lose the chance to understand who else may be involved in this before we act. Priya, who had remained quiet during this exchange, finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. Your Majesty, if I may add something. The particular poison used last night, a rare compound derived from the pale nightroot flower, is not something easily obtained within our own territory. It grows primarily in the eastern hills, in lands that border the Blackwood Pack's territory. Whoever supplied Garrick with this poison likely has connections beyond our own borders. The mention of the Blackwood Pack made Cale's expression darken considerably. Corwin Blackwood, he murmured, almost to himself. My father spent years maintaining a fragile peace with that pack, despite Corwin's ambitions to expand his territory into ours. If Garrick has been working with Blackwood agents, this is no longer simply a matter of one advisor's betrayal. This could be the opening move of something far larger. The room fell into a heavy silence at this possibility, the weight of it settling over everyone present. Ren, standing quietly near the door, found himself thinking of the stories he had heard whispered in the kitchens over the years. Stories of old conflicts between House Draven and the Blackwood Pack, of skirmishes along disputed borders, of a peace that had always felt more like a held breath than a true resolution. What would you have us do, Your Majesty? Red asked finally, breaking the silence. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes moving slowly around the room, settling briefly on each person present, before finally landing on Ren. For now, we continue as we discussed. Duncan will approach Colton Reyes carefully, seeking information without raising alarm. Priya, I want you to discreetly examine whether any other supplies within the castle show signs of tampering, in case Garrick had more than one method of attack prepared. Ret, increase the guard around my chambers and around Ren's, without drawing obvious attention to it. And Ren. He paused, his gaze steady. I want you to continue moving through the castle as you always have. Serve at meals, work in the halls, listen carefully to everything around you. If Garrick suspects nothing has changed in how the castle treats you, he may grow careless enough to reveal something further. Ren nodded, though his stomach twisted uncomfortably at the thought of walking past Lord Garrick Voss in the corridors, serving him wine at meals, pretending he did not know the truth of what the advisor had attempted only the night before. Your Majesty, Ren said carefully, will he not suspect something, given how visibly I approached your throne last night? All the hall witnessed it. He may suspect, Cale acknowledged. But suspicion is not proof, and a man as careful as Garrick will not act rashly on suspicion alone. Not when acting rashly risks exposing himself completely. He will watch, and wait, and try to determine what I know before he decides his next move. We must simply ensure that whatever he observes gives him no further reason for alarm. The meeting continued for a while longer, details being arranged, precautions being discussed, and Ren found himself increasingly drawn into the strange new role he now occupied, no longer simply a servant carrying trays of wine, but a quiet participant in the delicate, dangerous work of protecting a king and unraveling a conspiracy. It was terrifying, certainly, but there was also something else stirring beneath the fear, a sense of purpose he had never experienced before in his years of invisible service. As the others began to file out of the chamber to attend to their assigned tasks, Cale caught Ren's arm gently before he could follow them. Stay a moment, the king said quietly. Once the others had gone and the door had closed, Cale studied Ren's face with an expression that had softened considerably from the sharp, commanding tone he had used moments before with his advisors. You did not sleep last night, Cale observed. Neither did you, I imagine, Your Majesty, Ren replied before he could stop himself, immediately worrying he had overstepped. But Cale only allowed a faint, tired smile to touch his mouth. No, he admitted, I did not. He studied Ren a moment longer. I meant what I said last night. You have already changed everything, simply by choosing to speak. Whatever happens from here, know that I do not take that choice lightly, nor do I take lightly the danger it has placed you in. I would make the same choice again, Your Majesty, Ren said quietly. Even knowing everything I know now. Something shifted in Cale's expression at those words, something Ren could not quite name, though it left a strange warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. Then let us hope, Cale said finally, that your courage last night was enough to save more than just my life. Let us hope it was enough to save this entire pack from whatever storm Garrick Voss and his allies are attempting to summon against us. With that, the king turned back to the papers scattered across his desk, and Ren slipped quietly from the chamber, carrying with him the heavy knowledge of everything he now knew, and the uneasy awareness that the danger surrounding both himself and the king was far from over. 3 days passed in a strange, tense rhythm of ordinary appearance layered over hidden danger. Ren returned to his duties in the Great Hall exactly as Cale had instructed, serving meals, refilling goblets, moving quietly along the edges of rooms full of nobles who barely glanced at him despite the whispers still circulating about the coronation feast. He noticed Lord Garrick Voss watching him more than once during those days, brief glances that lingered a fraction too long before sliding away, and each time Ren felt a cold prickle crawl up the back of his neck. Duncan Pierce's careful conversation with Colton Reyes yielded little at first. The servant proved cagier than expected, deflecting questions about the feast preparations with practiced ease, though Duncan noted afterward that Colton's hands had trembled slightly throughout their entire exchange, a small tell that suggested guilt hiding beneath his composed exterior. On the 4th evening, everything changed. Ren was carrying a stack of folded linens down a narrow servants' corridor near the western wing of the castle, a route he rarely used but had been asked to take that evening due to renovations blocking his usual path. When he heard voices coming from a supply room just ahead, the door slightly ajar. He recognized one voice immediately as belonging to Colton Reyes, and slowed his steps instinctively, pressing himself against the shadowed wall beside the doorway. He grows suspicious, Colton was saying, his voice tight with anxiety. Duncan Pierce questioned me for nearly an hour, asking about the wine deliveries, about the crates, about who had access to them. I do not think our secret is as safe as you believe, my lord. Duncan Pierce questions everyone about everything, came Garrick Voss's smooth, unhurried reply. It is his nature, and it means nothing unless he has actual evidence, which he does not. The bottle was destroyed, There is no proof remaining that connects either of us to what was attempted. But the Omega, Colton pressed, his voice dropping lower, forcing Ren to lean closer to the doorway despite the danger of it. The one who whispered to the king, everyone in the castle speaks of it. What if he saw us that night? What if he heard something? There was a pause, long enough that Ren's heart seemed to stop entirely within his chest. It is possible, Garrick admitted finally. I have considered it. The timing is suspicious, I will grant you that. An Omega who has served invisibly in this castle for years suddenly finds reason to approach the throne directly. On the very night our plan was set into motion, and the king's reaction upon hearing whatever was whispered was extreme enough to halt the feast entirely. Another pause. If it was him, then he is a far greater danger to us than Duncan Pierce's questions. What will you do? Colton asked. Nothing rash, Garrick said. Not yet. I have sent word already to our friends beyond the eastern hills, informing them that our first attempt did not succeed as planned, and asking for patience while we determine our next approach. In the meantime, I intend to watch the Omega closely. If he knows what he should not know, I will find a way to ensure his silence becomes permanent, quietly, in a manner that draws no suspicion back to me. Ren's blood ran cold at those words, and he pressed his back harder against the stone wall, terrified that even the sound of his own frantic breathing might somehow carry through the gap in the doorway. Ensure his silence becomes permanent. He understood exactly what that meant, understood that Garrick Voss had all but confirmed his suspicion, and was now actively planning to eliminate the one witness who could expose his treachery. And the friends beyond the eastern hills, Colton said quietly. You still trust their promises? Corwin Blackwood is not known for generosity toward those who fail him. Corwin wants this pact destabilized, Garrick replied, his voice carrying the confident, dismissive tone of a man discussing matters well within his control. A young king, untested, dead before he has ruled a single full season, would have thrown House Draven into chaos that Corwin's forces could have exploited along our shared borders while we scrambled to determine succession. That opportunity has passed for now, but Corwin is a patient man. He has already suggested alternative approaches should our first attempt fail. What alternative approaches? Colton asked. That is not something you need concern yourself with, Garrick said, a note of warning entering his voice. Your task is simple. Watch the Omega. Report anything unusual in his movements or behavior. Leave the larger strategy to me. Footsteps shifted within the room, and Ren realized with a jolt of panic that the conversation was ending, that at any moment the door might swing open fully and reveal him standing frozen in the corridor with an armload of linens and an expression of pure terror. He forced himself to move, silently, carefully, backing away down the corridor as quickly as he dared without making noise, ducking around a corner just as he heard the supply room door creak open behind him. He did not stop moving until he had put considerable distance between himself and the western wing, his heart still hammering violently against his ribs, the folded linens nearly slipping from his shaking arms more than once. He needed to find Cale immediately. He needed to warn him not only that Garrick suspected his involvement, but that Corwin Blackwood himself was directly involved in the plot, and that further attempts against the king's life were already being planned. He found Rhett Calloway first, stationed near the entrance to the king's private wing, and the guard captain's expression shifted to immediate alarm the moment he saw the look on Ren's face. What happened? Rhett asked sharply, already reaching to steady Ren by the shoulder as the Omega nearly stumbled with the force of his hurried steps. I need to see the king, Ren said breathlessly. Now. It cannot wait. Rhett did not question further, leading Ren swiftly through the corridors and into Cale's private study, where the king sat reviewing reports from various territories under his rule. A task that clearly bored him far less than the danger currently pressing against his newly claimed throne. Cale looked up immediately at the sight of Ren's pale, frightened face, setting his papers aside without hesitation. What is it? Ren recounted everything he had overheard, the conversation between Garrick and Colton, the confirmation of Garrick's involvement, the alarming mention of Corwin Blackwood and his continued interest in destabilizing House Draven, and finally, the terrifying realization that Garrick now suspected Ren himself of exposing the plot, and was actively planning to silence him. By the time Ren finished speaking, Cale had risen from his desk entirely, pacing the length of the study with barely restrained fury darkening his features. Corwin Blackwood, he repeated, echoing Ren's earlier revelation with cold contempt. My father warned me of his ambitions before he died. He said Corwin would wait for weakness, for any crack in our foundation, and strike the moment he found one. I did not expect that crack to appear on the very night I claimed my crown. Your Majesty, Ren said carefully, Garrick spoke of ensuring my silence becomes permanent. I do not know what that means precisely, but I understood the threat clearly enough. Kale stopped his pacing and turned to face Ren directly, his expression hardening into something protective and dangerous in equal measure. "It means he intends to have you killed," Kale said bluntly, quietly, in a manner that draws no attention back to himself. "And I will not allow that to happen." "What will you do?" Ren asked, echoing Colton's earlier question to Garrick, without quite realizing the parallel. Kale was quiet for a long moment, clearly turning possibilities over in his mind with the same sharp calculation Ren had witnessed the night of the coronation feast. "We can no longer simply wait and watch," he said finally. "If Garrick believes you know the truth and intends to act against you, then waiting only increases your danger without gaining us further information. I must move against him soon, but I need enough evidence to ensure that when I do move, I move decisively, with no possibility of him escaping justice or dragging this pack into further chaos, through some final desperate act." He turned to Rhett, who had remained near the door throughout the conversation. "Double the guard around Ren immediately. I do not care how it appears to the rest of the castle. I would rather Garrick know I am protecting him openly, than risk losing him to some quiet act of violence in a shadowed corridor." "Understood, Your Majesty," Rhett said, already moving toward the door to arrange the necessary orders. Once Rhett had departed, Kale turned back to Ren, and something in his expression softened slightly despite the tension still radiating from his broad shoulders. "You have placed yourself in considerable danger tonight, simply by carrying an armload of linens down the wrong corridor at the wrong moment," he said quietly. "I am sorry for that. I never intended for the burden of protecting this pack to fall so heavily upon someone who never asked for any of this." "I chose to help, Your Majesty," Ren reminded him gently. "That night at the feast, and every day since, no one forced this upon me." "No," Kale agreed, "but that does not mean I take your safety any less seriously because of it." He studied Ren's face for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes. "Whatever happens next, know that I will not allow Garrick Voss, or Corwin Blackwood, or anyone else who threatens this pack, to harm you while I have breath left to prevent it." Ren felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest at those words, mixed uncomfortably with the lingering fear of everything he had just overheard. He did not fully understand the shifting nature of his relationship with the king, the way formal distance had begun eroding into something that felt dangerously close to genuine trust, perhaps even something more than trust. But there was no time to examine those feelings closely, not with Garrick Voss's threat still hanging over him, and Corwin Blackwood's shadow stretching further into the pack's future than any of them had previously realized. Outside the study window, evening had fully settled into night, the castle's torches casting long, flickering shadows across the courtyard below, and somewhere within those same walls, Lord Garrick Voss continued his careful, patient plotting, unaware that the Omega he suspected of betraying him had just confirmed every one of his fears, directly to the king himself. With the added guards now stationed openly around Ren, life within the castle grew stranger still. Nobles who had barely acknowledged his existence before now studied him with open curiosity as he passed, whispering behind their hands about the Omega servant who seemed to have earned not only the king's private counsel, but his active protection as well. Ren tried his best to ignore the attention, focusing instead on his ordinary duties, though the weight of two guards trailing several respectful paces behind him at all times made true invisibility impossible now, exactly as Kale had warned him that first night. Duncan Pierce arrived at the king's study early one morning with news that shifted the entire situation once again. He carried with him a folded letter, its wax seal already broken, and his expression was graver than Ren had yet seen it. "One of my contacts along the eastern border intercepted this," Duncan said, setting the letter before Kale. "It appears to be correspondence between Lord Garrick and an agent working directly for Corwin Blackwood. The handwriting matches samples we have gathered from Garrick's own correspondence over the years, compared carefully against his known records." Kale read through the letter slowly, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he set it down on the desk with controlled precision, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. "He speaks of a second plan," Kale said quietly, looking up at Duncan. "Something involving the Harvest Festival next month, when representatives from every territory under my rule will gather here at the castle. He writes that a larger gathering will provide more opportunities and greater confusion should our first, more contained effort prove insufficient. The Harvest Festival draws thousands to the castle grounds," Rhett said grimly, having arrived shortly after Duncan with his own reports on the increased security measures. Controlling every possible threat during an event of that scale would be nearly impossible. Ren, standing quietly near the window where he had been asked to remain during the discussion, felt a fresh wave of fear settle over him at the mention of the Harvest Festival. He remembered the celebration from previous years, The way the castle grounds filled with visitors from every corner of the pack's territory, merchants and farmers and representatives from smaller villages all gathering to celebrate the season's bounty. If Garrick and Corwin Blackwood intended to strike during such chaos, the danger extended far beyond just the king himself. "We have a month to prepare at least," Duncan said, studying the letter once more. "That gives us time to gather further evidence, to understand the full scope of whatever they intend, before we must act decisively." "A month is not much time," Cale said, "but it is more than we had before this letter arrived." He looked toward Wren then, his expression softening slightly despite the tension still gripping the room. "Wren, I want you to think carefully. Has Garrick approached you at all in recent days? Has he said anything, however small, that might suggest he is testing whether you know more than you should?" Wren considered the question seriously, running through his recent interactions with the advisor in his mind. "He has not spoken to me directly," he said finally, "but I have noticed him watching me during meals, longer than seems natural. And 2 days ago, Colton Reyes offered to help carry a tray I was already managing perfectly well on my own, which struck me as unusual, given that we have rarely spoken before." "They are testing you," Duncan said, nodding slowly, "watching for any sign of nervousness, any indication that you know more than an ordinary servant should. You must continue behaving exactly as you always have, Wren, difficult as that may be given everything you now carry." "I will manage it," Wren said, though privately he wondered how much longer he could maintain such careful composure under Garrick Voss's watchful, suspicious gaze. The following days brought little additional progress. Colton Reyes remained too cautious to reveal further useful information, and Garrick himself gave no outward sign of preparing any immediate action, content apparently to wait and observe, exactly as Duncan had predicted he would. Wren continued his duties, growing increasingly practiced at masking his fear behind a composed, ordinary expression, though the strain of it left him exhausted each night by the time he finally returned to his chamber. It was during one such evening, nearly 2 weeks after the letter's discovery, that Wren found himself unexpectedly alone with Cale for the first time in several days, the king having sent away his advisors early to attend to a private matter he had not yet explained. "I wanted to speak with you," Cale said, once the study door had closed and they were alone, "about something other than Garrick, or Corwin, or the Harvest Festival, if only for a few moments." Wren blinked in surprise, uncertain what the king could possibly wish to discuss beyond the crisis that had consumed nearly every conversation between them for weeks. "Of course, Your Majesty. You have been carrying an enormous burden since that first night," Cale said, studying Wren's face with an intensity that made the Omega's chest tighten uncomfortably. "Fear, danger, the constant weight of pretending everything remains ordinary, while knowing it does not. I have watched you manage it with remarkable strength, but I worry sometimes that I have asked too much of you, and given too little in return." "You have given me your protection, Your Majesty," Wren said quietly. "That is far more than most Omegas ever receive." "That is not what I meant," Cale said, his voice softening in a way Wren had rarely heard from him. "I meant something more personal. In these past weeks, working alongside you, relying on your courage and your careful attention, I have come to see you not simply as a servant who happened to overhear something important, but as someone whose judgment I trust, whose presence I have come to value beyond the immediate crisis that brought us together." Wren felt his breath catch slightly at those words, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected and startling admission from the king. "Your Majesty, I do not know what to say." "You need not say anything," Cale said, a faint, rare smile touching his mouth. "I only wanted you to know it. Whatever comes of this danger we face together, whatever happens with Garrick, with Corwin Blackwood, with the Harvest Festival looming ahead of us, I wanted you to understand that this closeness between us has become something I value deeply, beyond simple duty or gratitude." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Wren could not quite name, something that felt dangerously close to the beginnings of affection neither of them had expected nor been prepared for. He thought of every rule that governed the distance between Alpha and Omega, every unspoken boundary he had been taught to respect since childhood, and found, to his own surprise, that he did not wish to retreat behind those boundaries now, not when the king before him looked at him with such genuine, unguarded warmth. "I have come to value this closeness as well, Your Majesty," Wren admitted softly, "more than I expected to, given how it began." Cale's smile deepened slightly at that admission, though the weight of their shared danger never fully left his expression, even in that quiet, private moment. "Then let us continue forward together," he said. "Whatever the Harvest Festival brings, whatever Garrick and Corwin Blackwood attempt against us, we will face it together, and I will not allow either of them to take from me what has become important to protect." Wren nodded, unable to fully articulate the swirl of emotions building within him. Fear and hope and something warmer intertwining in ways he had never experienced before. Outside the study window, the castle grounds lay quiet under a clear night sky, unaware of the storm still gathering just beyond the horizon. A storm that would test not only the strength of the king's throne, but the fragile, unexpected bond forming between an alpha king and the omega who had once been invisible to everyone around him. The weeks leading up to the harvest festival passed with agonizing slowness, each day bringing fresh preparations for the celebration alongside quiet, careful planning to counter whatever threat Garrick Voss and Corwin Blackwood intended to unleash upon it. Duncan Pierce worked tirelessly, gathering additional evidence, cross-referencing correspondence, and slowly building a case detailed enough to justify decisive action once the moment came. Rhett Calloway, meanwhile, reorganized the castle's guard rotations, ensuring trusted warriors would be stationed at every critical point during the festival, without revealing the true reason behind the sudden increase in security. Wren, for his part, continued serving as bait of a sort, moving through the castle exactly as he always had, allowing himself to be watched by Garrick and Colton, without ever giving them reason to believe he suspected anything beyond the ordinary rhythms of castle life. It was exhausting work, maintaining such careful composure day after day, but the growing closeness between himself and Cale provided a strange comfort during quiet evenings, when the two of them could finally set aside the weight of their shared danger, if only briefly. It was during one such evening, 10 days before the harvest festival, that Ellen Marsh approached Wren with troubled news of her own. "I overheard something today," she said quietly, finding him alone in a quiet corner of the kitchens during a rare lull in the evening's work. "I did not think much of it at first, but given everything you told me weeks ago, I thought you should know." "What did you hear?" Wren asked, setting aside the vegetables he had been preparing. "Colton Reyes was speaking with one of the merchants who arrived early to set up for the festival," Ellen said. "A man I did not recognize, though he claimed to be selling spiced wine from the Eastern Territories. Colton asked him very specific questions about the layout of his stall, about which direction it would face, about how close it would sit to the main pavilion where the king traditionally greets the gathered representatives." Wren felt a chill settle over him at this description. "Did you hear anything else?" "Only that the merchant assured Colton his stall would be positioned exactly where requested, close enough to the pavilion to have a clear view of everything happening there." Ellen's expression grew more troubled. "Wren, I do not like this." It felt wrong, the way they spoke, too careful, too deliberate for an ordinary conversation about market stalls. Wren thanked Ellen for the information and immediately sought out Cale, finding him once again in his private study, reviewing final preparations for the festival, alongside Duncan Pierce and Rhett Calloway. He relayed what Ellen had told him, watching as the three men exchanged grave glances at the mention of the merchant's precise positioning request. "A stall positioned with a clear view of the main pavilion," Duncan mused, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "That could simply be innocent positioning for good business, or it could suggest something far more troubling, particularly given everything else we know." "An archer, perhaps," Rhett said grimly, "or someone positioned to create a distraction at a critical moment, allowing another threat to move against the king while attention is diverted elsewhere." "We must identify this merchant," Cale said firmly, "discover his true identity, his true purpose here, before the festival begins. If he is connected to Garrick or Corwin Blackwood in any way, I want to know it well before he has any opportunity to act." Duncan nodded and departed immediately to begin his investigation, while Rhett moved to reinforce security specifically around the merchant stalls closest to the main pavilion. Cale, meanwhile, turned to Wren with a troubled expression. "This grows more dangerous with each passing day," he said quietly. "I had hoped we would have more time to gather clear evidence before Garrick made his move, but it seems the harvest festival approaches faster than our preparations can match. What will you do if we cannot identify every threat before the festival begins?" Wren asked. "I do not yet know," Cale admitted, a rare moment of uncertainty crossing his features. "Perhaps I must consider postponing the festival entirely, though that carries its own risks, alerting Garrick that we suspect something, and potentially driving him toward more desperate, unpredictable action." Over the following days, Duncan's investigation revealed troubling details about the mysterious merchant, a man calling himself Bram Ashworth, who had no prior record of trading within House Draven's territory before this festival season. His paperwork, while superficially in order, contained inconsistencies that suggested forgery, and further inquiry revealed that his travel route to the castle had passed suspiciously close to the border shared with Corwin Blackwood's territory. "I believe this Bram Ashworth is not truly a merchant at all," Duncan reported during a tense meeting held just 3 days before the festival's opening. I believe he is an agent working for Corwin Blackwood, positioned within the festival grounds to either gather intelligence, create a distraction, or potentially participate directly in an attack against the king. Can we simply have him removed before the festival begins? Red asked. We could, Cale said slowly, considering the possibility, but doing so would alert both Garrick and Corwin Blackwood that we know far more than they believe we do. It would sacrifice whatever advantage remains in allowing this conspiracy to play out under our careful observation, potentially driving them towards some alternative plan we have not yet anticipated or prepared for. Ren, listening quietly from his usual position near the window, found himself speaking before he had fully considered his words. What if we allowed the festival to proceed as planned, but ensured every possible advantage was firmly in our favor? Let Bram Ashworth believe his position remains secret and secure, while surrounding him with hidden guards ready to act the moment any true threat emerges. Cale turned to look at him, something thoughtful passing across his expression. Continue, he said. If Garrick and Corwin Blackwood believe their plan remains undiscovered, they will proceed exactly as intended, walking directly into whatever trap we prepare for them, Ren continued, growing more confident as he spoke. But if we move too soon, removing Bram Ashworth or delaying the festival, we lose the chance to catch them in the act, with evidence undeniable enough to end this threat completely, rather than simply delaying it towards some future attempt. The Duncan nodded slowly, clearly impressed despite himself. The Omega speaks sense, he said. A trap sprung too early catches nothing but empty air. Better to allow them to believe they hold the advantage, right up until the moment we reveal otherwise. Cale considered this carefully, weighing the risks against the potential reward, before finally nodding with firm resolve. Very well, he said. We proceed with the festival as planned, but with every precaution multiplied tenfold. Rhett, I want hidden guards positioned near every merchant stall with any connection to Bram Ashworth or his associates, disguised as ordinary festival attendees. Duncan, continue gathering evidence right up until the final moment, in case we need it to justify swift action once the threat reveals itself. And Ren. He turned to look at the Omega with an expression that mixed gratitude with lingering concern for his safety. I want you nowhere near the main pavilion during the festival's opening ceremonies. Whatever role you play in helping us prepare for this danger, I will not have you standing directly within its potential path. Ren wanted to protest, wanted to insist that his continued presence and observation might prove useful during the festival itself, but the firm set of Cale's jaw left little room for argument, and beneath the protective tone of the king's words, Ren recognized something deeper, a genuine fear for his safety that went beyond simple duty or strategic necessity. As you wish, Your Majesty, Ren said quietly, though privately he wondered whether he would truly be able to stay away from danger when the moment finally arrived, given how deeply he had already involved himself in protecting the king he had come to care for so unexpectedly. The final days before the harvest festival passed in a blur of careful preparation, hidden guards positioned throughout the castle grounds, evidence quietly gathered and organized, and an undercurrent of tension that ran beneath the festive decorations being hung throughout the courtyards and halls. Ren found himself lying awake each night, staring at the ceiling of his small chamber, wondering what horrors or triumphs awaited them all when the harvest festival finally began, and whether the careful trap they had constructed would be enough to finally end the threat that Lord Garrick Voss and Corwin Blackwood had brought crashing into the beginning of Cale's reign. The morning of the harvest festival arrived bright and clear, the castle grounds transformed overnight into a sprawling celebration of color and sound. Merchant stalls lined every available pathway, their canopies striped in gold and deep autumn red, while the scent of roasted grain and spiced cider drifted through the crisp air. Representatives from every territory under House Draven's rule had begun arriving since before dawn, their carriages and wagons filling the outer courtyards, their voices blending into a constant hum of anticipation and excitement that masked, for most attendees, the quiet tension gripping those who knew the truth of what danger might be lurking among them. Ren stood at a window overlooking the main courtyard, having been assigned, per Cale's instructions, to assist with preparations well away from the central pavilion, where the king would soon greet the gathered representatives. He could see Bram Ashworth's stall from his vantage point, positioned exactly as Ellen had described, offering a clear view toward the pavilion, its owner moving about with the practiced ease of a man entirely comfortable in his false role as an ordinary merchant. Nearby, though carefully disguised among the crowd, Ren spotted several of Rhett's most trusted guards, dressed in simple festival attire rather than their usual armor, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding stalls with practiced vigilance. Duncan Pierce moved through the crowd as well, exchanging casual pleasantries with various attendees while his sharp gaze catalogued every detail of the unfolding scene. By mid-morning, the ceremonies began in earnest. Cale emerged onto the main pavilion dressed in formal regalia, the silver wolf crest of House Draven emblazoned across his chest, and the gathered crowd fell into respectful applause as he began his address, welcoming representatives from across the Pack's territory, and speaking of the prosperity he hoped to bring during his reign. Ren watched from his distant window, his heart pounding with worry despite the king's outwardly calm and commanding presence. It was during the king's address, as attention focused entirely on the pavilion, that Ren noticed something troubling. Colton Reyes had appeared near Bram Ashworth's stall, engaged in what appeared to be casual conversation, but his posture carried the same tense alertness Ren remembered from the supply room conversation weeks earlier. As Ren watched, Colton passed something small and wrapped in cloth to the merchant, who accepted it smoothly and tucked it beneath his stall's counter without any outward change in his relaxed demeanor. Ren's breath caught. Whatever had just been exchanged, it was clearly significant enough to warrant such careful discretion amid the festival's chaos. He needed to alert someone immediately, but Rhett's disguised guards were positioned too far from his current vantage point to signal quickly, and rushing down into the crowd himself risked drawing attention that might alert Garrick's allies to increase suspicion. He spotted Ellen nearby, assisting with a stall of festival breads, and hurried toward her, keeping his movements as casual as possible despite the urgency pounding through his chest. "Ellen," he said quietly, drawing her aside, "I need you to find Duncan Pierce immediately. Tell him Colton Reyes just passed something to the merchant at the eastern stall, wrapped in cloth, hidden beneath the counter. Tell him it happened just now, during the king's address." Ellen's eyes widened, but she nodded firmly and slipped away into the crowd without further question, trusting the gravity in Ren's voice. Ren returned to his window, watching anxiously as the king's address continued, wondering how long it would take for Duncan to receive the message and respond, and whether whatever danger had just been set into motion would strike before help could arrive. The king's address concluded to another round of applause, and the formal ceremonies shifted toward the traditional walk through the festival grounds, during which the king greeted attendees directly, moving among the stalls and pavilions with his personal guard trailing at a respectful but protective distance. Ren watched with growing dread as Cale's path brought him steadily closer to the eastern stalls, closer to Bram Ashworth's position, closer to whatever danger Colton Reyes had just delivered. He could not simply watch from a distance any longer. Abandoning caution, Ren rushed from his window and down through the castle corridors, weaving through startled servants and nobles until he emerged into the crowded courtyard, searching desperately for either Rhett or Duncan among the sea of festival attendees. He found Rhett first, positioned near the pavilion's edge, his eyes tracking the king's slow progress through the crowd with careful vigilance. "Captain," Ren gasped, breathless from his hurried run. Colton passed something to the merchant, hidden beneath his stall counter, just before the king finished his address. "Rhett, I sent Ellen to find Duncan, but I do not know if the message reached him in time." Rhett's expression sharpened immediately, and he signaled subtly to two nearby guards disguised among the crowd, directing them with a series of small hand gestures toward Bram Ashworth's stall. "Stay behind me," he instructed Ren firmly, already moving to close the distance toward the king's position. But even as they moved, the crowd ahead shifted with sudden alarm, voices rising in confusion and fear, as something unexpected unfolded near the eastern stalls. Ren's heart lurched as he caught sight of Bram Ashworth reaching beneath his counter, retrieving whatever had been passed to him by Colton, his expression suddenly sharp and focused in a way that shattered his earlier casual merchant's demeanor entirely. "Stop him," Rhett shouted, breaking into a full run as he shoved through the startled crowd, the disguised guards converging from multiple directions toward the same target. What happened next occurred in a chaotic blur of shouting and shoving, the festival crowd scattering in confused panic, as Rhett and his guards closed in on Bram Ashworth's stall. The false merchant, realizing his position had been discovered, attempted to flee, knocking aside his own stall's canopy in his haste, but the guards had positioned themselves too well, and within moments he was subdued, pinned against the ground with the small cloth-wrapped package secured firmly away from his reach. Cale, alerted immediately by the commotion, turned from his path through the crowd with visible alarm, his personal guard tightening protectively around him as the situation unfolded a short distance away. Ren, still following close behind Rhett despite the captain's earlier instruction to stay back, watched as Duncan Pierce arrived at a run, Ellen close behind him, both breathless from their hurried search through the crowd. "What is happening?" Cale demanded, his voice carrying clearly over the murmuring, confused crowd that had gathered to watch the sudden disturbance. "The merchant Bram Ashworth was caught receiving a package from Colton Reyes just moments ago," Rhett reported, holding up the small cloth-wrapped item for the king's inspection. We do not yet know its exact contents, but given everything we already suspected about this man's true purpose here, I believe it prudent to assume the worst until proven otherwise. Duncan carefully unwrapped the cloth package, revealing within it a small vial of dark liquid and a folded scrap of parchment covered in tight, precise handwriting. He scanned the parchment quickly, his expression growing grimmer with each line. "Instructions," Duncan said finally, looking up at Cale with grave certainty, detailing a plan to create a distraction during the closing ceremonies tonight, drawing security away from the main pavilion long enough for a separate group, positioned among the crowd, to move directly against your majesty. The crowd around them had grown deathly quiet, straining to hear the details of what was clearly a significant and dangerous revelation unfolding before them. Cale's expression hardened into something cold and unyielding as he looked toward Bram Ashworth, still restrained on the ground by Rhett's guards. "Where is Colton Reyes now?" Cale demanded. "Fleeing, your majesty," one of the disguised guards reported, having just returned from a quick search of the immediate area. He was seen running toward the eastern gate the moment the disturbance began. "Find him," Cale ordered sharply, "and bring Lord Garrick Voss before me immediately. This charade has continued long enough. Whatever evidence remains to be gathered, we have more than enough now to act." As guards rushed to carry out his orders, Cale turned to look at Wren, standing pale but resolute amid the chaos surrounding them. "You saw this happen," he said, not quite a question. "I did, your majesty," Wren confirmed. "I sent Ellen to find Duncan the moment I witnessed the exchange." "Then once again, your vigilance may have prevented a tragedy tonight," Cale said quietly, though the tension gripping his shoulders suggested the danger was far from fully resolved. "But this is only the beginning of what was planned for tonight's closing ceremonies. We must move quickly now, before whatever remains of Garrick's conspiracy has the chance to react to this exposure." The festival crowd, still murmuring with confusion and alarm at the unfolding drama, watched as guards led the struggling Bram Ashworth away in restraints, while others hurried toward the castle's western wing in search of Colton Reyes and, ultimately, Lord Garrick Voss himself. The carefully constructed trap had caught its first piece, but as Wren watched Cale's grim, determined expression, he understood that the true confrontation, the one that would finally reveal the full truth and consequences of the conspiracy against the king, was only just beginning. Colton Reyes was captured within the hour, found hiding in a storage barn near the eastern gate, too disorganized in his panic to have planned any true escape route. He was brought before Cale in the same private study where so many earlier discussions of the conspiracy had taken place, though this time the room held far more people than before. Duncan Pierce, Rhett Calloway, Priya Sundaram, and Wren, all present as witnesses to whatever confession might now be extracted. Colton, stripped of his earlier composure entirely, broke down within minutes of Duncan's careful, patient questioning, confessing everything in a rush of frightened words. He confirmed that Lord Garrick Voss had been working with Corwin Blackwood's agents for nearly a year, exchanging information about House Draven's defenses and internal politics in preparation for exactly this moment, the vulnerable transition following the old king's death, when a young, untested successor might be removed before he could fully establish his authority. "He promised me a position within Blackwood's territory," Colton confessed, his voice trembling. "Once the plan succeeded, once chaos followed your death, your majesty. I was promised wealth and standing far beyond what I could ever achieve serving merely as Lord Garrick's household servant. And the plan tonight," Cale said, his voice cold and controlled despite the fury clearly simmering beneath his composed exterior. "Explain it fully." Colton described the arrangement in halting detail, how Bram Ashworth had been positioned to create a distraction during the closing ceremonies, a small fire deliberately set near the festival's main stage, drawing guards and attention away from the pavilion long enough for a group of disguised agents, already embedded among the festival crowd, to move directly against the king during the resulting chaos. "How many agents?" Rhett demanded. "I do not know the exact number," Colton admitted. "Lord Garrick kept those details closely guarded, sharing only what each of us needed to know for our specific role. But I believe there were at least 5, positioned at various points around the pavilion, waiting for the signal." Cale's jaw tightened at this information, understanding the full scope of danger that had nearly unfolded that very evening. Danger that would have struck during a celebration meant to bring joy and unity to the pack, transformed instead into a scene of horror and chaos that could have ended not only his own life but potentially many others caught in the resulting confusion. "Where is Lord Garrick now?" Cale asked, turning to Rhett. "My guards report he remains in his chambers, apparently unaware yet that Colton and Bram Ashworth have been captured," Rhett replied. "He has given no indication of attempting to flee." Then let us not give him the chance to reconsider, Cale said, rising from his desk with cold, decisive purpose. Bring him before me, in the great hall, before all the gathered representatives who remain for the festival's closing ceremonies. I want this exposed publicly, completely, so that no doubt remains about what was attempted here, and so that Corwin Blackwood's involvement is made known to every territory under my rule. The great hall, still decorated with the festival's autumn colors, filled once again with representatives and nobles summoned hastily by Rhett's guards, confusion and worried murmurs spreading through the crowd as they gathered without clear explanation for the sudden assembly. Wren stood near the edge of the hall, close enough to witness everything unfolding, his heart still racing from the events of the day, uncertain what final confrontation awaited them all. Lord Garrick Voss entered the hall with his usual composed dignity, though Wren noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful, measured pace of his steps that suggested a man beginning to sense that something had gone terribly wrong with his carefully laid plans. He approached the dais where Cale stood waiting, flanked by Rhett, Duncan, and a restrained, downcast Colton Reyes. "Your Majesty," Garrick said smoothly, offering a formal bow despite the clear tension now visible in the gathered crowd around him. "I was told my presence was urgently required. How may I be of service?" "You may explain yourself, Lord Garrick," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "regarding a conspiracy to poison me on the very night of my coronation, and a second attempt planned for tonight's closing ceremonies, involving false merchants and hidden agents positioned throughout this festival's crowd." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the gathered representatives at this public accusation, and Garrick's carefully composed expression finally cracked, revealing a flash of genuine alarm before he could suppress it entirely. "Your Majesty, I do not know what you are suggesting," Garrick said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "I have served this crown faithfully for 20 years. Whatever accusation has been brought against me, I demand to know its source and its evidence." "Colton Reyes has already confessed everything," Cale said, gesturing toward the trembling servant beside him. "The poisoned wine on the night of my coronation, your correspondence with Corwin Blackwood's agents, tonight's plan involving Bram Ashworth and hidden agents throughout this festival. Do you deny all of this, Lord Garrick, before every representative gathered here to witness your response?" Garrick's gaze flicked briefly toward Colton, whose downcast eyes and trembling posture confirmed the truth of his confession without any further words needed. For a long moment, the advisor said nothing, the entire hall holding its breath as it waited for whatever response he might offer. "Corwin Blackwood promised stability," Garrick said finally, his voice low but carrying clearly through the silent hall. "A gradual transition of power that would have prevented years of costly border conflicts, years of young kings making the same reckless mistakes their fathers made before them. I did what I believed necessary to secure lasting peace for this pack, even if the method required sacrifice that others might find difficult to accept." "You attempted to murder me," Cale said, his voice cold and unyielding, "and to bring chaos and death upon this festival's closing ceremonies, endangering countless innocent lives beyond my own, all in service of ambitions that served Corwin Blackwood's interests, far more than they ever served this pack's true well-being. Do not dress your treachery in noble language, Lord Garrick. It changes nothing about what you attempted, nor the consequences you must now face." The hall remained utterly silent as Cale's words settled over the gathered crowd, the full weight of the exposed conspiracy finally becoming clear to everyone present. Garrick's shoulders sagged slightly, the last of his composed dignity finally crumbling as he recognized the impossibility of any further denial or justification. "What will you do with me?" Garrick asked quietly. "You will be held accountable for your betrayal, according to the laws of this pack," Cale said firmly. "And I will send word to Corwin Blackwood that his involvement in this conspiracy has been fully exposed, along with clear warning that any future attempt against this pack's stability will be met with consequences far more severe than mere words of condemnation." Rhett's guards moved forward at Cale's signal, taking both Garrick and Colton into custody, leading them from the great hall under the watchful, stunned gazes of the gathered representatives. As they departed, murmurs of shock and relief spread through the crowd, the full understanding of how close their new king had come to death, and how narrowly a far greater tragedy had been averted during that very evening's planned ceremonies. Cale remained standing at the dais for a long moment after the prisoners had been led away, his expression a complex mixture of exhaustion, relief, and lingering fury at the betrayal he had just publicly confronted. His gaze eventually found Wren, standing near the edge of the hall, and something in his hardened expression softened slightly at the sight of him. "It is over," Cale said quietly, though his voice carried enough for those nearest to hear. Whatever danger Garrick Voss and Corwin Blackwood intended to bring upon us tonight has been prevented, thanks to the vigilance and courage of those who refused to remain silent in the face of treachery. The gathered representatives began murmuring their approval, some offering quiet words of gratitude and relief, others already beginning to discuss among themselves the remarkable events they had just witnessed. But Wren, watching Cale's exhausted, relieved expression from across the hall, understood that while the immediate danger had passed, the true reckoning with everything that had happened, both the conspiracy itself and the unexpected bond that had formed between an Alpha King and the Omega who had first whispered a warning into his ear, was only just beginning to unfold. In the days following the exposure of Lord Garrick Voss's betrayal, the castle settled into a strange, uneasy calm, the kind that follows immediately after a storm has passed but before anyone fully trusts that clear skies will truly hold. Garrick himself remained held under careful guard within the castle's most secure chambers, awaiting formal judgment according to the Pack's ancient laws, while Colton Reyes and Bram Ashworth were held separately, their fates similarly pending the king's final decision. Cale spent long hours in council with Duncan Pierce, discussing the appropriate response to Corwin Blackwood's involvement, weighing the risks of open conflict against the dangers of appearing weak in the face of such blatant treachery. Wren, though no longer needed for the same careful surveillance work that had occupied him during the weeks leading up to the Harvest Festival, found himself drawn increasingly into these discussions, Cale seeking his perspective on matters far beyond what any ordinary Omega servant would typically be consulted about. "You have a clear way of seeing situations others might overlook," Cale explained one evening, when Wren questioned why his opinion continued to be sought on matters of pack governance. "The same instinct that noticed danger behind a curtain during my coronation feast serves you well in understanding the currents beneath more complicated political questions. I would be foolish to ignore such insight simply because tradition suggests I should." It was during one such evening discussion, nearly a week after the festival's chaotic conclusion, that Duncan arrived with news of Corwin Blackwood's response to the formal accusations Cale had sent regarding his involvement in the conspiracy. "He denies any direct knowledge of Garrick's specific plans," Duncan reported, reading from a formal letter bearing the Blackwood Pack's seal. "He claims any communication between his agents and Lord Garrick was limited to routine diplomatic exchange, and that if any of his people acted beyond authorized bounds, they did so without his knowledge or consent." "A convenient denial," Rhett said dryly, "given the clear evidence we have gathered connecting his agents directly to both the poisoning attempt and tonight's planned attack. Convenient, but difficult to disprove definitively without risking open conflict," Cale said, considering the letter's careful, evasive language. "Corwin Blackwood is skilled at maintaining plausible distance from his own schemes, allowing his agents to bear the full weight of exposure while he himself remains publicly untouched. What will you do?" Wren asked, genuinely curious how Cale intended to navigate such a delicate political situation. Cale was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "I will not pursue open war over this," he said finally. "Not yet, not without further provocation. But I will make it unmistakably clear that House Draven will not tolerate further attempts against our stability, and I will strengthen our borders and our alliances with neighboring packs who share concerns about Corwin Blackwood's ambitions. Sometimes the strongest response is not immediate retaliation, but patient, careful preparation for whatever challenges may come next." Duncan nodded approvingly at this measured approach, and the discussion continued, moving into details of specific alliances that might be strengthened, specific border defenses that required reinforcement. Wren listened carefully, occasionally offering observations that Cale and his advisors considered seriously, and found himself, despite everything, beginning to feel a genuine sense of belonging within these discussions that had once seemed entirely beyond his reach as a simple castle servant. Later that evening, once Duncan and Rhett had departed to attend to their respective duties, Cale and Wren remained alone in the private study, the fire crackling softly in the hearth as the last light of day faded outside the windows. "I have been thinking," Cale said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them, "about what comes next, once Garrick's judgment has been formally delivered, and this crisis has fully passed." "What do you mean, Your Majesty?" Wren asked. "I mean," Cale said, turning to face him directly, "that I do not wish for things between us to simply return to how they were before that first night at the coronation feast. I do not wish for you to fade back into the invisible role you once occupied, serving wine at feasts while I forget the courage and insight you have shown me these past weeks." Wren's heart quickened at these words, uncertain exactly what Cale was suggesting, though hope stirred cautiously within his chest despite his uncertainty. "What would you have instead, Your Majesty?" "I would have you remain close," Cale said, his voice softer now than Wren had ever heard it, stripped of its usual commanding authority in favor of something more vulnerable and genuine. Not simply as a servant kept for protection during a crisis now nearly resolved, but as someone whose counsel and companionship I have come to value beyond measure. I know the rules that govern such things between Alpha and Omega are rigid, and I know I ask something unconventional in suggesting we set them aside. But these past weeks have shown me that the traditions we cling to do not always serve us well, and I find myself unwilling to simply discard what has grown between us for the sake of maintaining appearances that never served either of us particularly well to begin with. Ren felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in Cale's words, by the unexpected turn his life had taken since that terrifying night behind the curtain when he had first overheard Garrick's whispered plot. "I do not know what to say, Your Majesty," he admitted softly. "Say only what is true," Cale replied gently. "If this closeness between us means as much to you as it has come to mean to me, then say so. And if it does not, if you would rather return to the quieter, simpler life you knew before all of this began, I will understand, and I will ensure you remain safe and cared for regardless of your choice." Ren considered the question seriously, thinking back over everything that had transpired since that first fateful whisper. The fear and danger, certainly, but also the unexpected trust, the growing respect, the warmth that had steadily built between himself and the king over these difficult weeks. He thought of the quiet, invisible life he had known before, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not wish to return to it, not when something far richer and more meaningful had grown in its place. "This closeness means everything to me, Your Majesty," Ren said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling within him. "I would not wish to return to the invisibility I once knew, not when I have found something far more valuable in stepping out from behind that curtain." Cale's expression broke into a smile then, genuine and unguarded in a way Ren had rarely witnessed from the king during their weeks of shared danger and careful strategy. "Then let us move forward together," Cale said, openly, without the pretense that once governed how we were permitted to interact. "Whatever traditions must adjust to accommodate this choice, I will ensure they do, for I find I care far more for your happiness and your presence in my life than I do for maintaining customs that never truly served this pack's well-being to begin with." Outside the study window, the last light of evening had fully faded into night, stars beginning to emerge across the clear autumn sky, and within the quiet, firelit room, an Alpha King and the Omega who had once been invisible to him sat together, no longer bound by fear or crisis, but by something far more lasting, a bond forged through danger and tested through weeks of careful trust, now finally free to grow into whatever future awaited them both. The formal judgment of Lord Garrick Voss took place 3 weeks later, in the same great hall where the coronation feast had once celebrated the beginning of Cale's reign, and where the truth of Garrick's betrayal had first been publicly exposed. Representatives from every territory under House Draven's rule gathered once again, along with envoys from several neighboring packs who had been formally invited to witness the proceedings, a deliberate choice by Cale to ensure the full weight of justice against such treachery would be known far beyond his own borders. Garrick stood before the dais, stripped of the fine gray coats and confident bearing that had once marked him as one of the pack's most trusted advisors, his expression resigned rather than defiant as Cale delivered the formal judgment against him. Colton Reyes and Bram Ashworth stood beside him, awaiting their own lesser judgments, their roles in the conspiracy having been considerably smaller than Garrick's own central involvement. "Lord Garrick Voss," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "you have been found guilty of conspiring against the life of your king, of colluding with agents of a rival pack to destabilize House Draven through murder and chaos, and of endangering countless innocent lives during what should have been a joyous celebration of this pack's harvest season. For these crimes, you are stripped of your title, your lands, and your position within this pack, and you are exiled from House Draven's territory, never to return under penalty of death." Garrick received the judgment with quiet dignity, offering no further protest or justification, understanding perhaps that his earlier attempt to frame his betrayal as necessary sacrifice for lasting peace had found no sympathy among those gathered to witness his downfall. He was led from the hall under guard, his exile to begin immediately, while Colton Reyes and Bram Ashworth received lesser sentences of imprisonment, their more limited roles in the conspiracy warranting mercy that Garrick's central involvement had not earned. As the formal proceedings concluded and the gathered crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves about the dramatic conclusion to a conspiracy that had nearly claimed their king's life, Cale remained standing at the dais, his gaze eventually finding Ren among the crowd, standing this time not at the edges of the hall in his usual servant's position, but closer to the dais itself, dressed in finer clothing than he had ever worn before, a quiet acknowledgement of the changed status that had settled over him in the weeks since Cale's private declaration. Cale descended from the dais and crossed the hall directly toward him, ignoring the surprised murmurs that rippled through the remaining crowd at such an open, public display of attention toward an Omega who had once served invisibly among them. "It is finished," Cale said quietly, once he had reached Ren's side. "The conspiracy exposed, justice delivered, and this pack's stability secured, at least for now, against whatever ambitions Corwin Blackwood may still harbor." "You handled it with wisdom, Your Majesty," Ren said softly. "Justice tempered with fairness, even toward those who wronged you so severely." "I learned that wisdom partly from watching you these past weeks," Cale replied, a faint smile touching his mouth. "Your instinct for seeing situations clearly, for understanding when mercy serves better than harsh punishment, has shaped more of my decisions than you likely realize." Around them, the remaining crowd had begun to quiet, sensing perhaps that something significant was unfolding between their king and the Omega who had first captured attention weeks earlier, with a single whispered warning that had changed the course of the pack's history. Cale, seemingly unconcerned with the growing audience, reached for Ren's hand, holding it gently but firmly within his own. "I wish to make something known publicly," Cale said, his voice carrying now for the benefit of those still gathered within the hall, "as I have already made known privately these past weeks. Ren Ashby, once a servant overlooked by nearly everyone within these walls, saved my life through his courage and vigilance, and has since become someone whose presence, counsel, and companionship I value beyond measure. I intend for him to remain close to me, not simply as a protected witness to past dangers, but as someone whose place within this pack, and within my own life, has fundamentally changed." A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the remaining crowd at this open declaration, though Ren noticed, with quiet relief, that the reactions carried more curiosity, and even approval, than the shock or scandal he might have once feared such an announcement would provoke. Perhaps the events of recent weeks, the exposed conspiracy, the courage Ren had shown throughout, had already shifted how the pack viewed him, preparing the ground for exactly this kind of unconventional but earned recognition. "Your Majesty," Ren said quietly, once the murmurs had settled somewhat, "I never expected, that first night behind the curtain, that stepping forward would lead me here, to this moment, standing beside you before this entire hall." "Nor did I expect," Cale replied, his dark eyes warm with an affection that had grown steadily since that fateful whispered warning, "that a single Omega's courage would not only save my life, but would show me a path toward leading this pack with more wisdom and compassion than I might have found alone. You changed everything that night, Ren Ashby, exactly as I told you at the time. I find myself grateful beyond words that you did." In the weeks and months that followed, the pack gradually adjusted to the unprecedented closeness between their king and the Omega who had once served so invisibly among them. Ellen Marsh, delighted by her friend's remarkable change in fortune, remained a constant and supportive presence, while Ren's sister Maeve found herself elevated alongside her brother, no longer confined to the castle kitchens, but welcomed into roles that honored the courage their family had shown during the crisis that nearly claimed their king's life. Corwin Blackwood, faced with the public exposure of his agent's involvement in the conspiracy, and Cale's carefully strengthened alliances with neighboring packs, chose caution over further open aggression, at least for the time being, understanding that House Draven under its young king's rule had proven far more resilient and clear-sighted than he had anticipated when he first began scheming with Lord Garrick Voss. And within the castle itself, life gradually settled into a new, unexpected rhythm, one where an Alpha King ruled not through fear or rigid tradition alone, but with the steady counsel and quiet courage of an Omega, who had once whispered a warning that turned his face pale before an entire silent hall, and who now stood openly beside him, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, but recognized fully for the courage and wisdom that had changed both their lives, and the future of an entire pack, forever.